It was the winter of 1864, and the Confederacy was bleeding out. From his headquarters, General Robert E. Lee, the South's most revered icon, would write a letter that proposed the unthinkable, a plan so desperate, so contrary to the very foundation of the South that it was considered blasphemy. He wasn't asking for more guns or more food. He was asking for an army of slaves. To many, this was the ultimate betrayal of the cause. To Lee, it was the last desperate roll of the dice. But what history rarely tells you is that this plan was already doomed. It wasn't just too late. It was a catastrophic failure before the first man was ever armed, because the Union already had a secret weapon that Lee and the Confederacy had fatally underestimated. An army 180,000 strong that was already on the battlefield, fighting with a fury born from generations of bondage.
To understand Lee's desperation, you have to feel the chill of that final winter. The Confederacy was a hollowed-out shell. Sherman had ripped the heart out of Georgia. Grant's relentless siege at Petersburg was strangling Lee's army day by agonizing day. The once proud Army of Northern Virginia was starving. Letters from home pleaded for husbands and sons to return to their own desperate families. Desertion wasn't just a problem, it was an epidemic. The recruitment offices were empty. The South had thrown its boys and old men into the meat grinder, and there was simply no one left. The government in Richmond was printing money that was nearly worthless, and the people were losing faith. The entire nation, built on a foundation of cotton and human bondage, was crumbling from within. The question hanging over every politician and general was no longer just, how do we win? It was, how do we survive another month?
The idea of arming slaves wasn't new. In late 1863, General Patrick Cleburne, a brilliant Irish-born commander, had circulated a proposal to do just that, promising freedom in exchange for service. He was promptly silenced. The backlash was severe. The idea was deemed a monstrous proposition. Why? Because it exposed the central lie of the Confederacy. Georgia politician Howell Cobb said it best, and his words cut to the bone. If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong. He was right. The entire Southern ideology rested on the belief that black people were inferior, docile, and unsuited for the duties of a soldier or a citizen. To put a rifle in a slave's hand was to admit that the whole brutal system was a fraud. It was an ideological surrender more devastating than any battlefield defeat. So they buried the idea. They chose to believe their own propaganda, even as their armies melted away. But while the Confederacy debated a fantasy, the Union had already made the leap. Abraham Lincoln, initially hesitant, had come to see the war's true revolutionary potential. The Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863, was more than a moral document. It was a weapon of war. It didn't just free slaves in the rebellious states. It invited them to take up arms against their former masters, and they answered the call. From all corners of the country, free black men from the North and escaped slaves from the South flocked to enlist. They faced racism, lower pay, and the scorn of many white Union soldiers. They knew that if captured, they faced torture and execution, not a prisoner of war camp. Yet they came. They came for freedom, for dignity, for a chance to fight for a nation that had never fought for them. The United States Colored Troops, the USCT, were born. Their first battle wasn't against Confederates, it was against the Union Army itself. The government decided to pay them $10 a month, with $3 deducted for clothing. White soldiers received $13 plus a clothing allowance.
It was a humiliating injustice. The men of the 54th Massachusetts, the most famous black regiment, refused to accept any pay for over a year, protesting the inequality. They served, fought, and died for a country that refused to value their lives equally. The protest took a tragic turn when Sergeant William Walker of the 3rd South Carolina Infantry was executed for leading his men to stack their arms and refuse duty over the pay issue. His death highlighted the brutal choice they faced: fight as second-class soldiers or die demanding the respect they deserved. It wasn't until 1864 that Congress, pressured by their bravery, finally authorized equal pay, retroactive for all who had been free men at the time of their enlistment. The question remained, would they fight? Skeptics in the North claimed they would run at the first sign of battle. The answer came on June 7, 1863, at a forgotten outpost in Louisiana called Milliken's Bend. Here, newly recruited, poorly trained, and inadequately armed black soldiers, many of them former slaves, faced a furious Texan assault. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand, a desperate struggle with bayonets and clubbed muskets. The defenders were pushed back to the riverbank, but refused to break. Their white officers reported fighting with the most desperate bravery. Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana, who witnessed the aftermath, wrote that the sentiment of the Army was changed. The bravery of the blacks was now a fact. They had paid in blood, but they had earned their respect and answered the question forever. They would fight. Just over a month later, the 54th Massachusetts would etch their name into history. They were chosen to lead the suicidal assault on Fort Wagner, a massive Confederate earthwork guarding Charleston Harbor. On the evening of July 18, 1863, after a day of bombardment, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw stood before his men. "I want you to prove yourselves," he told them. "The eyes of thousands will be on what you do tonight." As dusk fell, they charged across the narrow stretch of sand into a hailstorm of cannon and musket fire. They were torn to pieces. They clawed their way up the sandy parapets of the fort, engaging in savage hand-to-hand combat. Shaw was killed at the top, shouting, "Forward, 54th!" Sergeant William Kearney, though wounded multiple times, rescued the flag, insisting, "The old flag never touched the ground, boys." The assault failed. The 54th suffered nearly 50% casualties. The Confederates, in an act of contempt, buried Colonel Shaw in a common grave with his black soldiers, intending it as an insult. His father later declared it the highest honor possible, to be buried with his men. But in failure, they achieved a monumental victory. The story of their impossible courage electrified the North. It silenced the critics and spurred a massive wave of recruitment for the USCT. They had proven, on the nation's biggest stage, that they were second to none in courage and patriotism. They lost the battle, but their sacrifice helped win the war for public opinion, ensuring that tens of thousands more black soldiers would follow them into the fight. Their charge wasn't just on a fort, it was a charge against centuries of prejudice. A year later, at the Siege of Petersburg, black soldiers would again demonstrate their valor, only to be met with betrayal. The plan was ingenious: dig a tunnel under the Confederate lines, pack it with gunpowder, and blow a massive hole in their defenses. A division of USCT, specially trained for the assault, was supposed to lead the charge. At the last minute, General Meade, fearing political fallout if the attack failed and the black troops suffered heavy losses, replaced them with an untrained and poorly led white division. The explosion worked perfectly, creating a giant crater. But the white troops, instead of running around the crater as planned, ran straight into it, creating a confused, jumbled turkey shoot for the recovering Confederates. The USCT were eventually sent in, and they fought with incredible determination, actually managing to push beyond the crater. But the attack was doomed. As they retreated, a massacre ensued. Confederates shot wounded and surrendering black soldiers. In a horrifying turn, some white Union soldiers, enraged by the defeat, also bayoneted their black comrades. The crater was a tragedy, but what happened at Fort Pillow, Tennessee on April 12, 1864 was a calculated atrocity. The fort was manned by a mixed garrison of about 600 Union soldiers, roughly half of them black. They were attacked by a superior Confederate force under the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest, a brilliant but brutal cavalry commander who would later become the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. After the Union commander refused to surrender, Forrest's men stormed the fort. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. Overwhelmed Union soldiers, both black and white, threw down their arms and tried to surrender, but Forrest's men offered no quarter. They shot, bayoneted, and burned men alive. Eyewitness accounts describe a scene of pure horror, with soldiers hunting down and murdering surrendering troops. The massacre was a clear message from the Confederacy. For black soldiers, there were no rules of war. The news of Fort Pillow horrified the North and sparked outrage. A congressional investigation confirmed the details of the massacre, but for the black soldiers of the USCT, it became something else entirely, a battle cry. "Remember Fort Pillow" became their defiant shout as they charged into battle. It transformed their fight. It was no longer just for freedom or for the Union. It was now a fight for survival, a fight for vengeance against an enemy that saw them as less than human. The massacre backfired on the Confederacy. Instead of intimidating black soldiers, it hardened their resolve. They knew that surrender meant death, so they fought with a ferocity that stunned their Confederate opponents. They would rather die on their feet, fighting, than on their knees, begging for a mercy that would never come. All of this bravery, all of this sacrifice culminated in one of the war's most decisive battles, Nashville, in December 1864. The Confederate Army of Tennessee, under General John Bell Hood, was making a last-gasp attempt to reverse the South's fortunes. Defending the city was a powerful Union army under General George Thomas, and his force included over 13,000 men from the USCT. On the first day of the battle, 2 brigades of black soldiers were ordered to make what was thought to be a diversionary attack on the Confederate right flank. But they did more than divert. They charged with such power and determination that they completely overran the Confederate defenses on Peach Orchard Hill. Their success was a critical blow that helped unhinge the entire Confederate line. The next day, the Union Army shattered Hood's forces, effectively destroying the Army of Tennessee for good. In one of the war's final, pivotal victories, the USCT had been at the tip of the spear. And it was in this context, with the Union's 180,000 black soldiers proving decisive on battlefields like Nashville, that Robert E. Lee finally made his move. By early 1865, he admitted the obvious. We must decide whether slavery shall be extinguished by our enemies and the slaves used against us, or use them ourselves. He wrote to the Confederate Congress, throwing his immense prestige behind the plan to arm slaves. He knew it was an ideological surrender. He knew it contradicted everything they had fought for. But he was a pragmatist. His army was dissolving before his eyes, and he saw no other choice. His endorsement forced the Confederate government's hand. The debate was furious. Opponents screamed that they had entered the war to preserve slavery, and this was a betrayal. But with Lee's backing, a bill was finally narrowly passed. The bill that passed on March 13, 1865, was a pale, pathetic version of what was needed. It was too little and far, far too late. It didn't even explicitly promise freedom to the enslaved men who would serve. It left that decision up to their individual owners and the states. Think about that. They were asking men to fight and die for the Confederacy, with only a vague possibility of being granted their freedom afterward by the very people who enslaved them. It was an absurd, unworkable proposal. The war would be over in less than a month. There was no time to recruit, no time to train, no time to equip this phantom army. The entire project was a farce from the moment it was signed into law, a desperate act of a dying government clutching at straws. The recruitment effort was a total failure. Why would any enslaved person risk their life for the Confederacy? The Union Army was now an army of liberation. Freedom was just a short walk away to the Union lines, where they would be given a blue uniform, a rifle, and a chance to destroy the system that had enslaved them. Confederate recruiters were met with apathy and suspicion. In Richmond, they managed to scrape together a few dozen men, parading in through the streets in a sad attempt to boost morale. But it fooled no one. The vast majority of enslaved people in the South saw the Confederacy for what it was, their enemy. They had no interest in saving it. Their loyalty was to the army that carried the promise of emancipation, not the one that carried their chains. And then came the ultimate irony. On April 3, 1865, the Confederate capital of Richmond fell. The government had fled, setting fire to its own city. And who were among the very first Union troops to march in and restore order? The men of the United States Colored Troops. Imagine that scene, men who were once considered property marching as conquerors into the capital of the slave empire. They marched past the auction blocks where their families had been sold, past the offices of the politicians who had built a nation on their backs. They were witnesses to the final fiery collapse of the world that had enslaved them. It was a moment of profound historical justice, a scene more powerful than any politician's speech. The handful of Confederate black soldiers who had been drilling in the city just days before had vanished. They never fired a shot. 6 days later, Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was effectively over. Lee's desperate plan had produced nothing. It remains a footnote, a historical curiosity that reveals the depth of the Confederacy's delusion. They were willing to sacrifice their founding principle at the very last second, not out of a moral awakening, but out of a selfish desire to prolong their own existence. But it was an empty gesture. The history of the Civil War is not about the phantom black Confederate soldier. It is about the 180,000 very real black Union soldiers who fought, bled, and died to save the Union and end slavery. Their service didn't just change the war, it changed America. By fighting for the Union, they staked an undeniable claim to citizenship. Their sacrifice provided the moral and political momentum for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and gave black men the right to vote. Frederick Douglass declared, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship." But the war after the war would be long and brutal. The promise of Reconstruction would be betrayed, and a new system of racial oppression, Jim Crow, would rise from the ashes of the Confederacy. As part of this backlash, a powerful and insidious myth was born, the lost cause. This narrative reframed the Confederacy as a noble, heroic society fighting for states' rights, not slavery. It romanticized generals like Lee and Forrest, and a crucial part of this myth-making was the systematic erasure of the United States Colored Troops from the history books. Their contribution was ignored, minimized, or denied altogether. For generations of Americans, the story of the Civil War was told as a story of white men fighting white men. The 180,000 black soldiers who were essential to the Union victory were intentionally forgotten, their legacy buried under a mountain of monuments to the very men they defeated.
So why was Robert E. Lee's most desperate plan a total failure? It failed because it was a hollow, last-minute scheme built on a lie. It failed because it offered nothing that the Union wasn't already providing: a uniform, a weapon, and a clear path to freedom. But most of all, it failed because it fundamentally misunderstood the people it sought to arm. The Confederacy believed it could command the loyalty of men it had brutalized for centuries. It could not. The real story, the one that mattered, was happening on the other side of the battle lines. The story of the men who broke their own chains with a bayonet, who fought 2 wars at once, one against the rebels and one against the prejudice in their own camp. They didn't just save the Union, they forced it to be reborn, truer to its own ideals. They were the secret weapon Lee could never hope to match, and their legacy is the true victory of the Civil War.